Operating miniature consoles have been a bit of a thing over the last few years. We've been able to buy tiny versions of the likes of the SNES, the PlayStation, and even the TurboGrafx-16, but electronic manufacturers have made a fateful error. For some reason, no one has created a small version of the Vectrex. Bit of a gap in the market, don't you think? Originally released in the early 80s by GEC and later Milton Bradley, the Vectrex was the only vector-based video game console for the home ever released. Incorporating an inbuilt monochrome CRT monitor, overlays were attached to give the impression of colour. It was short-lived on the market, suffering from the video game crash of 1983, but more importantly for this video, never had a mini version released. Well, there was a prototype of a smaller revision from the 80s that never made it to market, but I think we can go even smaller than that. How about 13 or so centimeters high? Okay, now the Vectrex is miniaturized. I simply couldn't go down to Big W and buy this, however, so I built one myself. This was a massive learning project for both electronics and 3D printing. Including some hiccups with my 3D printer, its creation spanned from October 2021 to March 2022. During that time, I navigated lockdowns and extremely slow shipping times that hampered problem solving. This is a lot for a tiny device that essentially only has one function. But in the end, we're left with a functioning device that can play every Vectrex game ever released, as well as a few prototypes that are also played in full colour when applicable. I even built a replica of the original controller, which was a learning project in itself. So today, I'm going to show you the whole build process. It's going to be a long one, so get comfortable, brew some tea, and enjoy my trials and triumphs as I build the ultimate Vectrex Mini. Okay, time to spend some money, but not on a Raspberry Pi. I'll be using an existing Model 2 I have laying around. The first one I ever bought, actually, that's just been begging to be used in a project like this. Also, note, I'll be showing components for both the console and the controller here. Here is the power supply. The Model 2 is a bit odd in the fact that it needs the power supply to be rated at 5.1 volts and 2.5 amps. 5.1 volts is unusual, and I found that the more standard 5 volt supplies don't usually cut it even if they can output the amps. Even with emulating the humble Vectrex, I was routinely receiving power supply errors. This particular unit also comes with a power on-off switch built right into the cable. Next, we have a micro USB cable. Nothing out of the ordinary, except that it's spirally coiled to mimic what the original Vectrex used. Here, we have some mounting hardware specifically for the Pi, and this is a pillow speaker, my first ill-attempted method to produce sound, but more on that later. This is an Arduino Pro Mega, which I'll be using to power the brains of the controller. And on that note, here is the joystick. If you're interested, this is Arduino compatible and can be found by searching its commonly used product number, KY-023. Next, we have one of the most important purchases, a screen. This is 3.5 inches in size and has a resolution of 320 by 480 pixels. It's a TFT, so not exactly groundbreaking tech as far as screens go, but simply connects right onto the Pi's GPIO pins, so the physical installation is elementary. It's also a touchscreen, although we won't be utilizing that for this project. Lastly, this is a simple USB extension cable that can be mounted. I believe these are usually installed in vehicles. Okay, it begins. Let's start by plugging the screen into the Pi. Nothing of note is happening yet, and we're a long way from completion, but that blank white screen is symbolic in a way. Now, let's go for the money shot. Oh yeah. And the project began with a bang. Literally. It turns out the power supply was dodgy and exploded the second time I plugged it in. It even tripped the RCD in my house. To say the least, I shat my DAX. I'm gutted I didn't get it on film either, as the camera was even turned on but wasn't recording yet. Regardless, I couldn't help myself and pulled it apart to see what went pop. Dramatic. Luckily, it didn't stop this project in its tracks immediately by burning down my house. In the meantime, I temporarily used an old phone charger and dealt with the power errors until a replacement came in the mail, this time by a more reputable seller as opposed to Fleabay. It's getting quite hard to find them for the Pi too. At the time, I bought my replacement from Core Electronics here in Australia, but even as I'm typing this script months later, a quick search on their website only showed those for the Pi 3 and up. Still, they're worth seeking out, and this dodgy one is exactly the reason why. There was nothing special about the RetroPie installation. I used Balena Etcher to image the software to an SD card and configured everything using HDMI and a computer monitor. I'm using a wired Xbox 360 controller here as the custom build is still months away. A crusty old keyboard was also used to set up Wi-Fi since I would be using this to transfer the Vectrex ROMs. As you can see, there were no issues getting those to play. RetroPie ensures that's nice and easy. They are, however, still in black and white, so let's figure that out. Fortunately, as like for most things on the internet, someone has already figured it out. I found this thread on the official RetroPie forums. I've linked it below, but user, Media Mogul, has provided a download that includes all the overlays in PNG format, as well as config files for each game. All you need to do is ensure the config files are named exactly as the ROMs, and then transfer them to the Vectrex's ROM folder on the Pi. It's as simple as that, and works an absolute treat. That's all well and good through HDMI, but we need to output the video vertically for a tiny GPIO mounted screen. Suffice to say, that's easier said than done. And I'll be honest, I spent a lot of time getting this to work and was quite lazy in logging what exactly I was doing. I thought I wasn't, but months later, some key information is a mystery to even me. This sucks because A, I can't properly explain it to you, but B, if it breaks somehow, I'm pretty much screwed. Anyway, I'll explain as much as I can. First, I needed to enable SSH so the Pi could be edited more intimately over a wireless network. I used a free software package called Putty for editing on the command line, but the bulk of this is working thanks to a driver called FBCP-ILI9341. Pretty catchy, eh? Just slips off the tongue. There are plenty of guides on how to set this up, but my issue was that I needed it vertical and scaled properly. But for now, we did have a working screen thanks to the driver, even if it was orientated incorrectly. For some reason, I broke up the problem solving by plugging in the pillow speaker. This device is supposed to plug into a phone and play podcasts or whatever as you try to get to sleep. I thought this would be a great option if it was self-amplified. The plan was then to cannibalize it, but utilize the fact that it plugged into a 3.5mm jack. In a word, I was being lazy and trying to cut corners. Unsurprisingly, it didn't really work, but we'll come back to this later in the video. For now, I got the screen working just how I wanted it. Somehow. I am sorry I couldn't share more of how I got to this point. All I know is that it required an enormous amount of trial and error, messing with orientation and scaling variables. Also, something to do with CMake commands, I don't know. This video will likely be a week late simply because I spent hours trawling through bookmark tutorials and forums trying to figure out what I did. I even checked a thread I originally started on GitHub asking for help, and while the developer did eventually reply, I had found my own solutions in the meantime. I could have sworn that I replied to that thread explaining what I did, but no. Not good internet etiquette on my part, and especially not useful to me or anyone else. Moving on, I guess. By this point, I had a proper power supply, so it was time to get the audio figured out. The pillow speaker went into the bin, but my second attempt was only marginally better. Still trying to cut corners for some reason, I had the bright idea to wire two Mylar cone speakers directly to a 3.5mm jack. I can't actually remember if it outputted any sound at all. There may have been faint sounds, but what I can tell you with certainty is that this wasn't the final solution. No, what I needed was one of these bad boys. An Adafruit Mono 2.5 watt Class D audio amplifier, also known as a PAM8302. I also chose a more premium speaker, opting for this metal unit that outputs 8 ohms at 5 watts. Nice. Let's wire it up. I've linked a helpful Stack Exchange thread down below if you'd like to do something similar. I have no idea why I didn't show it in action here though, as this is where the footage ends. Oh well, you'll hear lots of it later on, I promise. But for now, this is the first case I've ever designed from scratch and printed. Frankly, I had no idea what I was doing. I thought that watching the likes of Ben Heck doing the same thing for years would have set me up more. So if it seems like I'm doing things absolutely the wrong way around, that's because I totally am. It all started with measuring. Lots of measuring. Lots of prototyping too, ensuring items fit perfectly where they were supposed to. The final case printing would eventually take approximately 20 hours, so it was critical that the dimensions were kosher before plunging into day-long prints. I was immediately glad I chose that method, as my first attempt at an insert for the screen was too small. Easily fixed however, and much quicker to print by itself. Next up was a mount for the USB extension cable. That took me 3 attempts if memory serves me correctly. I also designed and printed a mount for the Pi which could use that mounting kit. At that point, I still wasn't sure how the case was going to go together, but for now, that would be a problem for future me. I then got busy designing the front half of the case, incorporating the successful prototypes. I should add that I'm using Blender for modeling. While not what most people use for this type of work, I find Blender to be an incredibly powerful and versatile program. I still can't believe it's free either. With version 1 of that done, and yes, that's a spoiler, I sliced the model using Cura and fired up the printer. Cue the montage! The print came out super clean, but let's remove the supports. I'm constantly impressed by my printer considering its price, which is an Ender 3 V2 by Creality. The print took 12 hours and by the time it was finished, I actually had friends over since it was a Saturday night. I totally abandoned them though since I was so excited for the print to be finished. You can hear them having a good time in the background without me. Once the excitement wound down however, I realised that this print was not a success. I had made 2 key whoopsies while designing the model. Most concerningly, the screen didn't fit. This was disappointing since I spent so much time on the prototypes, but I must have accidentally edited the height of the hole during the design process. Additionally, I integrated the USB mount in backwards. Whoopsie indeed. Immediately, I started to think of ways I might get around doing a reprint. Hodgepodge solutions, one might say. The USB issue was easy. I could simply route the coiled cable underneath, since there was no real reason not to. As for the screen though, well... I thought I'd make the fitting bigger using, let's say, manual solutions. It worked about as well as you'd think. I thought it would easily grind down, but PLA is of course a very soft plastic. So, with my tail between my legs, it was time to accept that I needed a redesign. I decided to ditch the USB mount completely and instead replace that area with speaker grills, which is more akin to what's on an actual Vectrex anyway. I then triple checked that the screen insert was the correct size and sent it off to the printer. Except I then ran into problems with said printer, because of course I did.
Several months later,
I decided to take a break from the project and finally figured out my 3D printing woes during the Christmas break. The issue was that it would happily print for hours, only for the nozzle to somehow get clogged up. I'm still not sure what the issue was exactly, but after replacing the nozzle, the tube and several fasteners, it's printed like a dream ever since. Finally, all these failed prints can go on the bin. And here is the final print. Let's see if the screen fits. Thankfully, it does. It was a grand moment seeing it inside the case for the first time. You can also hear the speaker operating too. But remember how I said I had no idea what I was doing, seemingly making it up as I went along? Yeah, this will be the most apparent during this portion of the video. For some reason or another, I decided that the case should be in 3 parts. We'll get into why that's a bad idea later on, but for now, I worked on the middle part. This had its own issues of printing, but not because of the ender. This time, it was my fault. During the print, one of the corners would lift and warp, usually causing the whole thing to fall apart. This was because the 3D model itself was not completely flush. Again, not sure how I managed that, but my best guess is that I accidentally moved one of the vertices while adjusting something else. Regardless, an easy fix once discovered. Now, onto screwing everything together. Using the knowledge I gained repairing an N64's case in a previous video, I designed screw posts for the Pi's mount based on some random screws I had laying around. I used Tinkercad for this, using a generatable object called an isometric thread. This essentially allows me to produce a screw hole based on real-world measurements. The first attempt went a bit haywire, but it was revised and perfected using thicker shafts. It's all coming together in its own disorganized way. All we need is a final piece for the back. Yes, that fits, but nothing is attached. If only I had considered this during the design phase, it would have been much simpler. Basically, I had to manually line up the screw posts with the back of the case and then drill holes. Very rudimentary indeed. Luckily, everything lined up first go. I didn't need to re-drill anything. But, of course, that's just attaching the screen and Pi to the back of the case. The front still isn't secured to anything. Did I mention this was a learning project? So, back to the chalkboard. I was definitely kicking myself that I didn't design in the screw posts originally. To simplify things a bit, I decided to glue the middle and back pieces of the case together. It should have been one piece to begin with, but I can't understate how much of a cowboy I was being during the design phase. Mistakes, hopefully to never be repeated. I glued and screwed so it would set lined up correctly. I then grabbed anything I could to weigh it down while it dried. That was a success, but I still needed to figure out how to connect the 2 halves. I'll be damned if I was going to wait for another 12-hour print at this point in the project, so the improvisation continued. The solution was another shaft. Positioned strategically and designed to the correct height, it would be glued into the front half and screwed in through the back like the other screws. Just like before, it was screwed in while drying to make sure it would be in the correct spot when all was said and done. And it didn't work. Turns out it wasn't quite long enough. That's an easy fix though. After reprinting, regluing and rescrewing, this little side project to completion was a success. There are still the decals to discuss, but it makes more sense chronologically if we talk about them during the construction of the controller. So, let's take a closer look at the components for the controller. There's the joystick module, several run-of-the-mill push buttons, and finally the brains, the Pro Micro. This came with headers that I soldered into place. There is plenty of wiring and Arduino code examples online for controllers with joysticks that use the Pro Micro, but unfortunately the first I found didn't totally work. I prototyped using a breadboard, and while the buttons worked fine, the joystick was erratic. No amount of configuring in Windows helped. I also tried my luck by plugging it straight into the Pi as is, but unsurprisingly received the same result. I also had the idea to directly solder the wires from the joystick to the Pro Micro, but all that did was get me one step closer to lead poisoning. Fortunately, I later found another code example that worked with the same wiring. You'll find that link below. With it in a working form, we can now start to design the controller's case, learning from all the mishaps of the console. To begin, I started to prototype the functional parts. This consisted of a jig to hold the switch and the button in place, a mount for the joystick module, along with a nubby thing that mimics the original, and lastly, a mount for the Pro Micro so it's not flapping in the breeze. Once those were tinkered enough, I designed the case. This time, it's only 2 halves, and with screw posts as standard. There was no mucking around with measuring and gluing this time around. Everything has been perfectly lined up in software. I even got a bit fancy by introducing a lip between the 2 parts, so they connect more securely before screwing commences. Although, having said that, there is a top section that makes more sense to print separately and glue, but this is purely for aesthetics. This way, I save on a lot of supports that would need to be printed if they were one piece. And here is everything printed, except for the decoration on the top. Everything went well during the initial print. Thankfully, there was no need for revisions. So I got busy installing the buttons, the joystick, and all the necessary mounts. Everything did screw together successfully, although it was here that I forgot to add a hole on the back for a button that's used to access menus. No worry though, easily amended. You can also see here that I've glued the top pretty it up piece. I guess I didn't bother to film that. With everything secured in place, it was time for the slightly laborious task of wiring. This went off without a hitch, but I realised that the rear button wasn't long enough to stick through the hole I had just drilled. For now, I'll wire it up, but give it some fresh breeze and come back to it later. While it's definitely mum's spaghetti in there, it works. Now, for a quick exploration into my failed foray creating decals. I'll be wanting advice from those who have experience too, so pay attention. I had fun designing decals to go on the controller and above the screen on the console, both being based on what's on the real thing. To achieve that, this project introduced me to another great open source and free program called Inkscape. I did originally use Photoshop, but you really do need a vector-based program for this sort of work, and I'll be damned if I'm giving Adobe more money than I already do to use Illustrator. No, Inkscape served me well, and if anything, I at least learned how to use it during this project. Before paying for professional prints, I printed out a few test fits using my budget Canon that's running out of ink. Everything went well, so I looked to the local stationery megastore, Officeworks, to print out something of a higher quality. First, I tried their adhesive posters service, and overall, it was a bad experience. While the print quality is good, it's made of this weird cloth-like material that frayed as I tried to cut it. Also, even though I sent Officeworks the same PDF, it doesn't appear to have printed to scale, even though my consumer-grade Canon managed okay. Not exactly useful when you're trying to align a series of buttonholes. I stuck them on anyway, but didn't like the look of it at all. It kinda looked okay when it was out of focus. The fraying was a deal breaker. The material did not react kindly to having holes cut through it. It's a shame too, since the print quality was so high. I ripped them off, but we'll get back to this. In the meantime, I returned to that rear button that wasn't long enough for the hole. This was solved by printing out a little nub that was the same width and gluing it on. Naturally, I squeezed out way too much glue and got it all over my hands. This was tough to clean off. Once that was set, on the button, not on my hands, I hot snotted the button in place. Not the cleanest way to do it, but it's basically a surface button around the back, so it's a bit out of sight, out of mind, if you know what I mean. I also designed and printed this little accent side piece for the console. This was glued on too, since it wasn't structural, but the glue left these weird white marks that not even IPA would clean off. It's like the glue had a chemical reaction. So yeah, won't be buying that brand again. I only bought it because the Cellies was out of stock. Okay, decals attempt number 2. The plan now was to order traditional prints that weren't adhesive, since the posters from before seem to be all that Officeworks offers in that department. It was cheap, so I ordered prints in both gloss and matte to see what would look best. And to be honest, I'm not really happy with either. There were lines across some of it, like the printer was running out of ink. That's disappointing, Officeworks. The header on the console went on first as it was the easiest, although for some reason I used that same damned glue which left the same marks. I then turned my attention back to the controller, which was nothing short of a disaster. Again, the holes didn't line up at all. I don't understand how my dinky little home printer can manage the scale fine, but Officeworks can't. It's like something in their process slightly warps the print. I went to a lot of effort to be sure that it was printed out at the right size in relation to an A4 piece of paper too. So, I gave up on that. It's a pity since I was so happy with the design. Does anyone have any recommendations for this sort of thing in Australia besides Officeworks? I was unable to come up with a suitable competitor. Anyway, that's the controller. It's a pity how it ended, but I am happy with the construction. This has been a long video and even longer project. Let's wrap things up. We're finally done. Even though there was a seemingly endless series of misadventures, we do have a finalized product that is operational. Let's hope I never have to format that SD card. While I am very happy with the outcome, there are aspects I would do better if I were to do it all again. For one, I would seek out a much higher quality screen. While the resolution is sufficient, the viewing angle sucks. You need to be looking right at it to view it properly, which is actually quite hard considering the form factor. The fact that it's inset so far into the front case means that you do need to crouch and be head height with the console while playing. Not exactly comfortable. Another major change would be the case design. Yes, I do feel like I've properly conveyed throughout this video that it was a bit of a crash course in case design and very much a learning project, but I'll definitely never be designing anything using that "I'll figure it out later" sort of attitude again. The successes of the controller's design are promising and a hopeful look into future projects. Speaking of the controller, some of the more astute among you may have noticed how high it is compared to the original. Honestly, I'm not sure how I could have made it more low profile considering the parts used, but again, it was my first, so I'm sure I'll figure out better processes for future builds. Regardless, 8 pages of scripting is enough for me. Time to terminate this video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more content like this. I've already had another idea that's currently in its research phase, but until then, see you in the next one.